So really what I want to talk about is some of those nutritional management strategies that we can use. I want to take a little deeper dive into some of the things that Jocelyn alluded to in her talk today. So as we look at that, I can never get the slides to switch the first time. There we go. So this is a little bit about what we wish things looked like all the time. We spend a lot of time talking about rain here, either how much we're getting or not getting. This was August of 2017 over near Sonoyta, and as you can see, we must have been having a pretty decent year. But the reality is we often look more like this. So drought is a reality, as we all know right now. If we take a look at that US drought monitor for Arizona, this is basically this week in 2019 and 2020. And most of us were doing okay, except for those of you in the north and northeast. I don't know what to tell you, except I'm really sorry. But most of the rest of us were actually looking okay. But let's take a look at this year. It's not good, right? Most of us in D3, D4 exceptional drought. We're pretty deep into this. In fact, I had to go back to July of 2020 to find a map that didn't look like this. So we've been here a while. And because of that, drought is a reality in Arizona. And as producers, we need to do some things. We need to understand those potential short and long-term effects of drought. Jocelyn did a really great job earlier talking about some of those long-term effects on our herd and even some of those effects on those heifers we might choose to retain that were raised during drought. It's also important that you understand the special health and nutritional challenges presented both during drought and after drought. And then have a drought management plan in place for the ranch. We talked a little bit about that earlier today too. And also on our rangelands, we have issues on our cattle and on our rangelands as well. Those loss of those key herd genetics, if we have to sell or get rid of a big population of our animals, we've lost genetics that we may have spent time and investment in. We may have decreased productivity, that's fewer and lighter calves because these animals are just struggling out on these rangelands. And it can be a really slow process to rebuild afterwards. Being really diligent about culling those non-productive and non-prime age animals, so those older animals first, and trying to support that core genetic base of our herd is really going to help us get through that as best we can. But if the drought is severe or long lasting, like the one we're in right now, it's actually likely that we'll have to cull some genetically desirable animals, which we really like to avoid doing. And finally, on our rangelands, as that drought situation continues on, decreased productivity, loss or reduction in key forage species, those are often the first ones that we lose. Loss of productivity, our decreased stocking rate, we just have less rangeland out there. There's just less forage. And finally, erosion impacts. As we lose those forage species and we lose grasses on those rangelands, when the rains return, when animals are back out there again, we have a lot of impacts from erosion. So let's talk primarily about the problems that are related to drought in terms of nutritional management. The big one, malnutrition, and then also things like water quality and quantity. So with malnutrition, really what we're looking at is first of all, we have the forage that's out there is insufficient in energy and protein. It's going to be poor quality. It's going to have fewer nutrients. It's going to have much lower protein than what we normally would have. And we're going to talk about protein supplementation and take a little deeper dive into that too. So likely it's not going to be able to meet the cattle's needs. And the other thing that we know is as that forage quality decreases, as it becomes lower in protein, it actually decreases the cow's ability to consume that forage. So it's kind of a little bit of a double whammy. Not only is that forage of poorer quality, she's not able to consume or digest as much of that as she normally would be able to. We'll also see just less available forage. In some cases, we just don't have anything for the cattle to eat. Often we'll see increased energy output. Those cattle tend to have to walk further to graze or have to walk further to find water as some of their sources may dry up. And finally, that mobilization of body energy reserves, that loss of body condition, where we see cattle start to drop from a body condition score 5 to a 4, to a 3, maybe even lower. And those are things that we really want to avoid if we can. Those are the things that are going to really impact our cattle's ability to produce a calf and raise a successful calf that year. And that's your paycheck, right? So the effects of poor body score on reproduction are very, very well documented. And maybe we can see about dropping that link in the chat when we get to the end here. I'm afraid if I try to do it, I might mess up my slideshow. But reproductive effects on cattle are huge. Cattle that are calving in low body condition score have more issues with dystocia. Dystocia is anything that is a difficult birth, where they have trouble having that calf. Not only is this dangerous, if they're out on the rangelands and they have trouble and we aren't there to assist them, we could lose one or both of them. But even if she actually does have the calf successfully, cattle that experience dystocia are more likely to retain their placenta. And the reason that that's important is that means it's going to take her longer to cycle for the next calf, for the next pregnancy. And we know that cattle have a very short window to get bred back on time to stay on a yearly cycle. And so what that means is she'll start to slip every year. She'll have her calf later and later and later as that time to cycle is long. So we want to try to avoid that if possible. She could also just flat out lose her calf. If her groceries drop too low early enough in that pregnancy, she could flat out just lose her calf. And we also see decreased service capacity in bulls. Some of that may just be to cattle being more spread out and on the rangelands trying to find things to eat. And the other thing that we see is these immune effects. More increased weak or dead calves, calves that simply aren't getting enough nutrition from their mothers, increased abortions from infectious agents, and more post-weaning health problems like bovine respiratory disease complex. We know that those cows that calve at a body condition score of 4 have a pregnancy rate that's 20 to 30% lower than cows who calve at a 5 or above. Cows who calve at a body condition score 3 or lower see a reduction of an additional 20 to 30% in pregnancy rate for the next pregnancy compared to cows who calved at a 5 or above. So all these factors really factor into, causing our calf crop to really decrease during drought. So how can we combat this? There's a few things that we can do. We talked earlier about culling, just simply reducing the number of animals we have to something more manageable for the drought situation. And those first animals to go should be those older animals that are already not producing or will imminently not be producing. Really, that's a good time to get rid of any that have broken mouth or potential to shortly have broken mouth, because they're going to struggle the next year on the rangelands anyway. You might as well go ahead and cull them now and leave more groceries out there for those more productive animals. Supplemental feeding is really what I want to mention a lot about today. This is how we can really preserve our ranching operation during drought. This is not a one-size-fits-all. There are a variety of options out there that may or may not work for you depending on your setup. So it's important to note that and to see what might fit best for your operation. You may need to have a place to hold cattle for feeding. Depending on the type of allotment you're grazing, whether it's federal or whatever, some of them don't allow supplemental feeding. So you need to pay attention to that. You may need to move those cattle to a different land type. There's also a lot of expense associated with this, cost and labor, labor being a big one. Also during drought years, we know there's shortages of hay because everybody's trying to feed hay. So those are going to come at a higher cost. This may be something that's necessary to preserve those cow herd genetics and keep those high producing animals, the ones that are important to us to keep in our herd, so that when we come out of drought on the other side, we're in a better position. So the first thing to think about before we even consider what type of supplemental feeding we're going to do, one thing we want to do is we want to inventory the herd. Who's here? Who's producing? This comes down to record keeping. Are you keeping good records? Do you know which cow is calving on time every year and which cow is maybe lagging behind a little bit? Maybe she's having a calf every 14 months or 16 months. And it seems like every year, but it's really every 16 months. So keeping those good records as best you can is really key to know this. When we are supplemental feeding, if we can do that, and we could also maybe sort that herd a little bit, we can actually choose to supplement in such a way that we're giving it to the animals that are the most valuable or that need it the most. And the animals that maybe need it a little less, we can feed a little bit less, so that we are trying to be economically sound with that decision. We also want to go through and cull. I know I've said it multiple times and I'm going to say it again. We got to cull, and we got to cull early. As soon as we know we're in a drought situation, we should be really thinking about and having a plan in our mind of which animals are going to be the first ones to go. Those unproductive animals, those older animals, those animals that have maybe some production issues, maybe they have a bad udder, maybe they have a bad mouth, maybe they are starting with some cancer eye. It might be time to go ahead and send those down the road now rather than paying to feed them. And finally, this is what I want to dive into. Consider the best type of supplementation for your situation, whether that's going to be an energy supplement or a protein supplement, and never forget the minerals. This is another good publication that I will also see about dropping in the chat. I saw Betsy got the other one. Oh, look, and she got that one too. Thank you, Betsy. So let's talk about what we call an energy supplementation. This is really just providing calories. Energy is calories, okay? So this is hay, cube, cake, grain, anything along those lines that we're literally just trying to get some groceries into those cattle. This is the best option if you are in a situation where you have no grass or forage on the rangelands, where you have nothing to pull from. Cattle will need 1.5 to 2% of their body weight daily. This is in hay, a little variation depending on how you choose to mix some other things in there. To help stretch those resources further, this is where that herd inventory really comes into consideration. Remember, those animals that are lactating are going to have a higher energy requirement than dry animals. So if you can have any way possible to try to sort, I know in some situations on some ranches, it's not an easy thing to ask you to do. But if that's something you can do, it can help to keep those costs down a little bit. The thing with this is you really have to feed it daily. It's labor intensive to do this. You are going to have to literally go out there and provide feed for these animals. And that just comes at a cost of labor, fuel, all those types of things. But can help weather the storm, keep key genetics on the ranch. And what I really want to talk about with that is our V-bar-V experience feeding cattle. So in the 2018 drought, the V-bar-V, which for those who don't know, that's the University of Arizona's ranch up near Camp Verde, kind of stretches east and west between Camp Verde and like Happy Jack. So for the 2018 drought, and I think this was in like June, July, May, June, I can't remember, June, July, I believe, June, I think. What the V-bar-V ended up doing was actually moving all the cattle off of pasture onto private land. And this wasn't that they didn't have forage, it was actually a water issue. They didn't have accessible water for these animals in that pasture. So the total cost for them to feed, they were feeding hay to these animals. At that time, it was $2.50 a ton. It was costing about $2.15 per head per day just in hay, okay? The total cost, the $2.52 a day, that included the fuel to run the generator and pump for the water at that location, also a protein mineral tub supplement, and the hay. So the total cost per animal was $2.52 per day, and they fed for 50 days. This came out to a total of $126 per head for that 50-day duration of feeding, okay? And what they found, they compared the cost of feeding these cows to the cost if they had chosen to actually sell some of them and then replace them later when the drought was over at those current market conditions at that time. So they used those actual market conditions and they considered the potential future productivity of those animals into this. And one of the things that we kind of came up with here was that if those cows were young, under 9.25 years, we know that as cattle hit about 7 years, they sort of reach peak productivity. And after about 10, their productivity, meaning their calf size, tends to drop off fairly sharply in how big of a calf they wean. So they found that 9.25 years was sort of their magic number here. And if those cows were younger than that, they actually found that it profited them about $86 a head to go ahead and keep those animals and actually feed them in this situation. But if those cows were older, if they were older than that 9.25, they actually lost $28 a head choosing to feed them rather than if they had sold them and replaced them after the drought. So just some interesting things. And obviously this is just one scenario in one drought situation, in one market condition. Since 2018, market conditions have changed rapidly. So this may not hold true every year. This is just something to think about. And this was just their experience this year. We know during drought, the cull cow market can be really depressed because everybody is trying to sell cull cows. So the prices are not that great. And we know that oftentimes after a drought, the market for replacement animals can be pretty high because everybody's trying to replace those animals that they had to sell off. The other consideration was they did only have to feed for 50 days. They got lucky, monsoon season kicked in, brought some rain, brought some relief, and they were able to put cattle back out on pasture. What would have happened if this had gone on for 100 days, 180 days? I just said it's now March, and I had to go back to July of 2020 to find a map that didn't have that big widespread drought in it on the drought monitor. And that's something that you just don't know when you go into drought. So if you're considering something like this, know that you are taking a little bit of a gamble. You don't know how long this is actually going to last. This one happens to be particularly long. But you have to weigh the cost of preserving your genetics and preserving the animals that you have acclimated to your ranch and your operation versus replacing with animals of unknown history, unknown vaccination status, all those types of things. And that's a question that only you can answer for your operation, but it is some things that you should be thinking about as you work through those drought plans is, are there certain animals that you would choose to keep and feed? And it's okay if it's only a portion of your animals, but just something to consider that these did work out for them. So we talked about those energy supplement feeding hay essentially. The other thing that you can do is protein supplementation. This is best used if you have some forage resources. You have a grass bank that some pastures you hadn't grazed in a couple of years and you've got some couple-year-old forage banked out there or something like that. This could also be used if you're feeding hay and all you could get was really, really poor quality hay, or that was the only thing that was available to you or that was at a reasonable cost to you. What this protein supplementation will do, if you remember, a cow's rumen functions much like a large fermentation vat. It is full of microbiota bacteria that break down and digest the forage. And that's really actually what the cow uses. They produce these volatile fatty acids, and that's actually what the cow is able to utilize. So this process allows cattle to consume relatively low quality forage compared to other animal species, particularly things like horses. But when the protein content in that cow's diet drops below a threshold, and that threshold is about 6.25%, we usually say just about 7, just to be safe. That protein can no longer support the bacterial population of the rumen, and it starts to decrease in numbers and activity. And that's where we get that double whammy, where that cow is not able to consume as much feed of that poor quality feed as she could as if it was better quality. So in this situation where if that is the only forage you have available to you, providing a protein supplementation can really, really, really help that cow increase her forage intake. In fact, studies have shown that cattle that are fed a poor quality hay diet of less than that 6.25, but supplemented with a protein supplement can actually increase their intake up to 27% or more in forage intake. So by doing this, we can allow her to take advantage of those resources that we have, even if they're poor quality. So 6.25 is that generally accepted cutoff. We do say the protein supplement needs to be at least 22% crude protein. And if the protein percentage is higher, you do see a better response. During this time, be very careful if your protein supplement includes urea. Generally, that's not recommended for cattle on rangelands. The issue can be that if they consume too much of it, it can be toxic very quickly, especially if they aren't consuming that supplement every single day. And that is one really big benefit to feeding a protein supplement. If you have a grass bank to rely on, it's a lot less labor intensive. It can either be left out free choice in the form of a tub, a lick, or whatever, or it can be provided at 7 times the daily rate 1 day per week and still be effective. So you don't have to feed it daily. You can feed it as little as 1 day a week, or in many cases, you have options for a free choice type lick or tub or whatever that we're probably pretty familiar with. And finally, the last thing I want to talk about, don't forget the minerals. Minerals are often short in Arizona forages in normal years, particularly things like copper, selenium, zinc, and phosphorus is a really big one. And the big thing with phosphorus is it's water soluble. And so very quickly, as soon as forages start to become very mature, that phosphorus leaches out extremely quickly. We've done quite a bit of mineral sampling across the state in recent years. We have several ongoing projects going on to look at this. And we really recommend a real mineral supplement. The red blocks, not a mineral program. Okay, don't bother. Get a real mineral balanced program. And for most of us in Arizona, that's going to also mean one that includes selenium. Most of the state is very deficient in selenium. There are a few of you up in the very north, like along the strip, that may not be as deficient. Your forage can be tested for this very easily. The Utah State Lab does it. It's super easy to go out, get some samples. You bag them up in a baggie like this. As you can see, we collected this sample in February of 2017. And what you want to just try to do is get a representative sample of what the cattle would be eating. Out there, they have 4 types of grommas that are pretty equally distributed. And so we just equally gathered them up, put them in a bag, make sure they're dry so they don't mold, and ship them off to the lab. And they'll do a really good job sending that back to you. Obviously, this is not going to be a, oh, I'm deficient in copper by X parts per million, I need to supplement exactly that. That's not quite how it works. It's not that precise. There's a lot of issues with bioavailability of minerals, but it can tell you where your forages stand, what you might be deficient in or have excess of, and help you pick a mineral program that will fit for you. So we know those drought-stricken forages in particular are especially likely to be low in minerals, like I talked about, potassium and phosphorus, and allowing cattle free choice access to a balanced mineral supplement can keep cattle productive in drought. I know it seems like an extra expense, but if what we're trying to do is make sure that we're at least generating some income and having some good quality calves on the ground, especially if we're thinking about keeping some heifers out of this drought situation, making sure that they were provided with a mineral supplement while they were in utero can really go a long way to making sure that they're going to stay productive in the herd. One of the last things I want to discuss is water. We know water quantity is going to be an issue. Those dirt tanks tend to dry up. Sometimes wells even dry up. The big thing that I see as a problem, water quantity and quality, as those dirt tanks sink and mud becomes the edges, cattle have to wade in further to get drinks. And I see a lot of issues with cattle getting bogged down and having to get pulled out. That's a big problem. There's not much to do about that other than if you can fence them off and provide a drinker and haul water. I know that sucks. I know nobody likes to do that, but it is something to consider that could be an issue for you. The other thing is dissolved compound concentration. So a lot of those minerals and things can actually, particularly like sulfur and stuff, can actually build up in the water and get more concentrated. You think about that pool of water has a certain amount in it. And as the water pool shrinks, as it evaporates, the minerals are not evaporating along with it. They're pretty much staying in the water. And so there's less water, but more minerals. So they're getting more concentrated. So you can actually reach a point where you're having problems with water quality because of that. And then finally, as those bodies of water shrink and start to get warmer in the sun, we can have problems with bacterial or toxic algae blooms. So just keep an eye on those water sources. Make sure you don't see anything odd going on with them, odd smells, films on the top, that kind of thing. We can always test those also if necessary. And then salt toxicity. I see this as a problem when cattle consume salt and are unable to consume enough water to balance. So if they go hit the mineral pretty hard and then go immediately to go get their drink of water and their water source has dried up, maybe there's another one, but they don't know where it is, we can have problems with that. So just be cautious when you do provide those minerals, that you make sure cattle have access to appropriate water. And finally, toxic plants. This is a chronic issue for us, but particularly hard in drought years. It's no surprise that they go up. Cattle will start to eat things that they normally avoid because it's the only thing green, because they're hungry and this looks good. Snakeweed and burrowweed, I've seen some problems with, particularly in drought years. But even things that are not normally toxic can become toxic. Johnson grass particularly can produce hydrocyanic acid as these plants are subject to drought and stressed. So this is just something that I don't know that there's a lot to do with this. The big thing, I guess, is, oops, went too far. The big things that I could tell you to do to help avoid this is don't overgraze pastures if you can at all help it. I know that's struggle during drought years. If you are supplementing feed, particularly if you're providing hay or something like that, don't suddenly stop just because you got rain and some things greened up. Take a walk out there and make sure that the things that are greening up aren't snakeweed. I don't know if you can tell what this is, a grazed snakeweed, and I don't see a lot of grazed snakeweed. Cattle don't like it. In this situation, they grazed it pretty heavy because it was the only green thing out there, and the producer had been supplementing hay, saw green, stopped feeding hay. Cattle said, "Hey, I'm hungry," and they lost quite a large number of animals to snakeweed. We did talk briefly about early weaning calves. I know Jocelyn touched on this as an option. It does help reduce a cow's nutritional requirement. That lactation is the biggest calorie need for those animals, and it can improve your rebreeding rates for next year's calf crop. They've done some research where they've kind of showed the benefit is not really in the calves. You wean those calves early, you do note that you will probably need to supplemental feed them. You'll probably need to make sure that you've got their vaccination program really tight so that they don't get sick on you because they've been weaned a little bit early. And we don't really see much benefit in the calves. Okay, they're kind of come out as a wash. Just because we put some labor into them, we put some feed products into them and that kind of thing. But where we do see a benefit is in those cows the next year that rebreed. And in particular, those first calf heifers, if you can early wean their calves in particular, you'll have a better chance of keeping them in the herd the next year. Just because they're the ones that are still struggling, they're the ones that are still growing themselves, and they're the ones that will see the biggest benefit from this. Calves have been successfully weaned as young as 6 weeks to 60 days. Do know if you do that, they'll probably need a little extra help. Ideally, I would try to stick to a 3 to 5 month window, just because they're a little bit easier to take care of at that point. Is that you have a little better luck with them. You don't have to be quite as intensive with them. And there's that link that Betsy dropped in the chat. Thank you. And just to wrap up, there's no one size fits all method. Have a plan, do that plan early. Your plan needs to be tailored to your ranch, to your goals, to your pasture situations, your water situations, are you super susceptible to drought in one of those corners, like up in the Four Corners area that always seems to be in drought? Or are you someplace that only struggles with it every few years? Just keep those in mind. Keep those records, forage production and inventory, accurate herd inventory, and if you can, those yearly rainfall records. myrangelog.org is a really great one to start with to help you keep those. Mike does a really great job with that, and a lot of our range colleagues work on that as well to help you guys monitor that situation. But the final thought here for the day: without management, drought effects will devastate your herd. The most productive cows are going to be the ones that will last without management support, because they're the ones that are out there spending the extra resources to have a calf every year, and likely they're the ones that will end up being lost. Those first calf heifers, second calf cows are the highest risk, but have that plan. And a little plug for the alert program, if y'all don't know what that is. If you have an unexplained death loss, this program can help figure out what those are, with the goal being to facilitate a rapid responsive diagnosis. So if you have something like that and you want to trigger an alert response, you can work with your veterinarian to help trigger that response. And with that, I am a couple minutes over, but I am finished.
Very good information, though. Very nice job. So I think one question: how much does it cost to run a forage analysis?
Though the forage analysis, the one that we were doing with all the minerals and protein content, runs about $35 to $40 a sample.
Okay.
And there's a little cheaper if you only want protein, or if you don't want like the full mineral package, you only want a few of them. But I believe it's about $35 will get you pretty much everything.
Okay. And then also, Ashley, can you speak to things to be aware of when pulling cows from the ranch to feed at another location? For example, what issues could you have when returning to the ranch, and changes to the rumen are things you should plan to do, be aware of, or expect when you return to the ranch?
Yeah, absolutely. So anytime you're changing their diet, be aware of the possibility of bloating. So if you're pulling cattle off of a forage system, if they're out grazing rangelands and you pull them in, don't immediately start throwing them hay and 40 pounds of corn a day. That's going to be a real problem. So just make sure that you try to keep forage to forage, and hay is a forage, that's fine. Give them some time to adjust, watch them very closely before, if you start adding anything additional to the diet, do that kind of slowly so you don't have problems with bloat. And the same thing when you're going back, particularly watch out when you're going back to the rangeland. Like I mentioned, those toxic plants can be an issue. The cattle should remember, but just make sure that you've walked around and looked at the only things that are green. Just because you're seeing green out there, walk out there and ascertain what it really is, that it's not all just snakeweed and burrowweed and crap. It's actual forage that's greening up so that they have something to consume when they get out there. That's going to be kind of the biggest things that I can think of off the top of my head.
Okay, so got a great night, quality speakers. Thank you. We love that feedback. And attendees should tell a friend, a fellow producer, that they missed out. We also had can you send us the links that were in the chat, please? And I would say Ashley could probably send those to.
I can send them to Debbie and we can get them out.
Who could post those? Yes.
Yeah, when we send out the links, for the recordings, we'll also send those links out, as well as probably the evaluation again.
Okay.
I'm sure Betsy dropped the evaluation link in the chat, I think I saw, so.
Yeah, and just a note on that evaluation's for all 3 nights. So if you're only attending beef, then just go ahead and fill it out. You'll get an email reminder at the end anyway. If you're staying for other nights, then wait till the end to fill it out. Our salt blocks recommended for drought. Also, what is the best mineral block?
So best mineral block is a trick question. It's not a block. Okay, those red blocks, don't waste your time. You need to get a real mineral supplement, something like, I know Purina's got some good products. I know Wright makes a good product. There are several good products available in the state. Anything that is a real mineral mix. Sometimes it's loose, sometimes you can get them mixed into tubs. You can even get them already combined with protein tubs in some instances. I always recommend those over just those red trace mineral blocks. Those are trace, there's not enough in there, and also cattle don't consume them at the right rates. Usually they're just too hard. I don't find those to be very effective. Salt is okay during drought. In fact, cattle, so they've done some studies to see if cattle crave minerals, and actually the only things they chase are salt and taste. So if it tastes good or if it's salty, they'll eat it. So salt is important. If you're doing a mineral mix, salt should be in there. It's usually both the thing that entices them to eat it and also the thing that keeps them from eating too much of it. So it's kind of the limiter in there. Just be very careful if you are using salt during a drought, like I said, that your cattle have access to a reliable water source that's not going to dry up. So as long as they have access to their normal water that's reliable and they know where it is, then you're good to continue with that as you have been.
And the alert program does include tribal producers as well.
As far as I know, it does.
Yeah, that's an answer actually.
Yeah. We've done them on the tribes before.
Yeah. And let's see, we've got for records, cattle and land resources, check out the Bove IQ app available for Android and Apple. Really a slick, easy to use tool.
Oh.
We've got from Andrew Brisky gave us Utah state prices for forage analysis. And
thank you, Andrew, for post. Oh, that's to all panelists. I don't think everybody can see that. Hang on, let me just I'm going to repost that for everybody to see. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay.
That will, protein. So protein tubs, you have a huge variety to choose from in the state, honestly, as long as it's at least 22%. I know Purina makes one. There are, and that's not an endorsement of any brand. There's a variety out there. Most of the feed stores have them. I can't think of the name of the one that the ranch that I just helped here uses. There's a variety. Just work with your local feed store, whatever that happens to be. You really can't go wrong as long as it's at least 22% cattle licks. Thank you. That's the one I'm trying to think. Crystal licks. That's the one I'm trying to think of. Thank you. Any of those are fine.